And we're live. All right. So to folks who have been watching, we're doing this every night this week at 6 p.m. We have a different candidate for running for Senate. On the Democratic side, we have a primary coming up here on June 2nd. For folks who have been watching, you might see a little different background from me. My home has a outage of internet right now. So we're adapting with the times and everything. So I'm here at most people know Cody from on my staff. I'm at his place. We're comfortably 8 feet apart and doing what we can. But my guest tonight is Cal Woods. Cal, welcome. And I would love to have you introduce yourself and to folks who haven't met you before, talk a little bit about your background and what got you motivated into running.
Thank you, JD. I appreciate that. So I grew up on a Lynn County hog farm. My dad was also a factory machinist. He worked at Universal Engineering in Cedar Rapids, member of the Machinist Union for 35 years. My mom worked at the Mount Vernon Bakery. At 17, right out of high school, I joined the U.S. Navy. I served on board the USS Chicago in the navigation department. Our ship was patrolling the Western Pacific. After the Navy, I graduated from the University of Iowa and worked as a reporter for 16 years in Colorado and Iowa. I left the news business in 2008, which freed me up to volunteer on some political campaigns. So I volunteered for Barack Obama in 2012. I was a precinct captain for Martin O'Malley in 2016. I've also volunteered for Leonard Boswell, our former late great Congressman Leonard Boswell, and for Stacey Apple when she ran a few years ago as well. So probably about last summer, I was thinking about running for the United States Senate, and I wasn't seeing the kind of sense of urgency that I want to see from candidates with regards to two issues in particular, healthcare and our climate crisis, and we can maybe get to that a little bit later. So I was just sort of testing the waters last summer up in your territory. I was in Lyon County, and I started knocking doors in Larchwood and Rock Rapids. That was my first day in actually testing the waters, knocking doors. I got a very good reception. I know that's a very Republican area, but I got a pretty good reception there. Not everybody was willing to sign my nominating petitions, but it was a nice night, and I had a good time in Larchwood and Rock Rapids. So
my dad's from Larchwood. So, sorry to interrupt, but my dad's from Larchwood, so I know Larchwood very well.
It's what, about 6 miles from the Minnesota border, about 12 miles from the Big Sioux River?
Yep, that's about right.
Yeah. So it was a very nice night, and it was I figure if I can do okay in Steve King country, soon to be JD Scholten country, I can do okay anywhere.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So one of the things that I wanted to do was talk about issues that are kind of the backbone of the 4th district. And sure. You growing up with your dad and everything, and so wouldn't be, you have knowledge, working hand knowledge on agriculture, and we're the second most agriculture producing district in America. And so even there's so many small towns that were built off the backbone of that. And there's a lot of, even if it's off working in town, but there's a lot of jobs that are related to it. So these are hard times and depressed farm economy for about 6 years now at the very least. And I just got to say one thing before I ask the question. Folks, if you do have a question, if you're watching on Facebook Live, put them in the comments, we'll get to them. And then if you're watching this on Zoom, in the chat room, there's a chat available. Ask your questions in there. But getting back to the question, agriculture, my question here is, farm bankruptcy has hit a 8-year high in the past year. And so what are some of the things that you're looking to do when you win?
Well, I'll just start with my dad grew up in Woolstock in southern Wright County, just north of Webster City. My great-grandfather had a hotel and a barbershop in Woolstock close to 90 years ago. It was a booming little town back then. And like many small towns in Iowa, it's facing some tough challenges. There's not a lot left in places like Woolstock. So we have some big challenges ahead of us. But, you know, one of the things that have been a real challenge for farmers is the vertical integration in our agriculture system. There's just 4 grain companies that control almost the entirety of grain exports from the United States. Same thing happens with pork and chicken and beef packers. That vertical integration vertical integration has squeezed the farmers from both ends. You know, when farmers buy their inputs in the spring, the seed and their chemicals, they pay the other guy's price. When they sell their crops in the fall, they pay the other guy's price. They don't have any control over that. The elevator gives them a price, they either take it or leave it, and if they're ready to sell, if it's a fair enough price, they take it. So farmers are being squeezed from both sides, but there's a number of things that we can do. First of all, I think we need to do everything we can to ban or restrict vertical integration. Packers should not be owning livestock. Too many farmers have become hired hands on their own farms. The packers own the livestock, and even worst case scenario, some foreign multinationals like the Chinese that own Smithfield. Too many of our farmers are working for multinational companies, and certainly in some cases the Chinese, and there you don't have our best interest in mind. So we have to do what's best for America. We have to do what's best for American farmers, and that means banning multinational ownership and banning packer ownership of livestock. That's a good place to start.
Yeah, Cal, that's music to my ears. That's one of the number one things I talk about is, at the very least, we need to enforce our antitrust laws.
Absolutely.
And, I literally did a video yesterday, and it would be up and we would send it out already if my internet wasn't down at home. But it's addressing this right now. And there's a stat I learned yesterday that just blew my mind. 60% of our apple juice is made in China. And just think about all the apple orchards just throughout Iowa that could just make juice for our local communities. And so I'm really glad you I think that you hit the nail on the head with your stance on agriculture.
You mentioned the antitrust. Since we have four multinational companies that are controlling almost all of our grain trade, there's no reason that those can't be broken up and provide more competition so farmers would have more options. They could actually market their grain rather than taking the price that one of those four exporters are offering.
And one of the areas that we're seeing right now with COVID-19, some of the plants have workers, and I know in Sioux Falls yesterday, it was announced in the Smithfield plant up there, they had 80 workers test positive for COVID-19. And so when it's concentrated like that, there's not too many options for a workaround. But if we had more local regional packers, that would, one, create more jobs and more rural jobs, and two, we'd have opportunities to adjust in more markets. So
the concentration of ownership has benefited the packers at the expense of Iowa farmers, unfortunately.
That's exactly right. So moving on to childcare. So United Ways of Iowa Executive Director Deanne Cook has said that Iowa has one of the lowest entry points for qualifying for children or childcare assistance. So people who do not have enough to make ends meet are still struggling and still left out. How would you expand childcare?
Well, two things. First of all, we got to raise the minimum wage. So people who are now making minimum wage or maybe even $8, $9, $10 an hour, if they were going to put even one child in childcare, that's going to take a significant portion of their take-home income, and they can't afford that, and many times have to make the choice of staying at home and hoping that one of the two spouses can provide enough to support the family because they can't really afford childcare if there's even one or sometimes two kids. So number one, we raise the minimum wage. Number two, we need to provide a tax credit. So those families who would like to work have an opportunity to receive a tax credit and can maybe afford to send their kids to childcare for maybe the first 2 or 3 years until they're ready for kindergarten or preschool.
Yeah. Just a reminder, folks, if you have a question, if you're watching this on the live stream on Facebook, put it in the comments below. We'll get to it. If you're watching it through Zoom, there's a chat room area that you can ask the question and we'll get to them as well. So moving on to childcare policies, or I'm sorry, education. Moving on to education. And we talked about consolidation in agriculture. This is now, we've seen a lot of consolidation in schools, and some kids are on a school bus for an hour and a half each morning or each day just to get to and from school. So what are some plans for education and anything specific with rural as well?
Yeah, that's a big challenge because a lot of our communities are losing students, losing population. Like I mentioned Woolstock earlier, one of the things that I think we can do, we need to have opportunities for kids for remote learning. Um, now that we have the COVID-19 restrictions, I know a lot of the schools are moving over to that because they don't have the opportunity to gather kids in the classroom with their teachers. So I think there's probably going to have to be even more remote learning. Some of the smaller schools that maybe only have 70, 80 kids in the whole school, they can't afford to have teachers to teach all the advanced classes in the sciences and mathematics. And I know there's some experimentation with that as well. But I think, again, we need to, Iowa used to be a leader in education. We used to be among the top states in the country with regards to the number of kids who would graduate, the number of kids who were, or the smallest number of kids and adults who were illiterate. We were a leader in education, and we've fallen behind a little bit. And I think that's a reflection of the amount of money that we put into education. I think our values have to be reflected on our budgets, and unfortunately our legislature to some extent has played down the importance of education at the expense of our kids. I heard the other day that China, who is going to be a major competitor of ours on many fronts, is now graduating more honor students than the United States is graduating students. That's a trend that is not going to bode well for us. The kids are our future. Our budgets have to reflect our values. And if we have to spend more money for education for the future of this country, that's a price that we must pay.
That's exactly right. I'm proudly wear this sweatshirt pretty often. America needs teachers. And my I'm a fifth generation Iowan, first to be raised in town, come from a long line of farmers and educators. And one thing that really bothered me was talking to folks up, especially in the northern part of the district that borders the Minnesota border. There's a lot of folks who went up north after collective bargaining got cut. They can make $8,000 more in Minnesota than they can here in Iowa. And then where I live here in Sioux City, it was unheard of for somebody to be in Sioux City and then teach in Nebraska or South Dakota when I was growing up. But now we're seeing that, and it's just it's one of those things. When I graduated high school 21 years ago, we were first in the nation in education, and that one year we got number 2 to Minnesota. Everybody freaked out, and now we're nowhere near that. And so education is it used to be, I mean, it's on our state coin, for heaven's sake. So.
Our future depends on a well-educated workforce, and we can't afford to shortchange our kids the kind of education that we had 20 and 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Or in my case, a few more years ago than that.
You mentioned your 2 of your biggest things are climate change, and the other was healthcare. And here's a healthcare question for you.
Yep.
A simple way to describe healthcare in Iowa's 4th district is healthcare costs are skyrocketing while healthcare accessibility is shrinking. What are your plans on healthcare and hopefully to expand it?
Yes, sir. Well, let's start with the nature of the problem. We spend more on healthcare per person than any other country in the world, about $11,000 per person, which is about double what most of the other developed nations pay. And the primary reason for this is health insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. We spend about 20 cents of our healthcare dollar on insurance companies because insurance companies have to pay for marketing, advertising, salespeople, CEO salaries. David Wickman, the CEO of United Healthcare, made about $18 million last year, which is about 300 times what the average, the mean income for employees in his own company made. And then, of course, shareholders, if it's a privately held company, shareholders expect to have a profit. If we have a government public option healthcare system, those marketing costs, for the most part, go away. The advertising costs go away. Certainly, the $18 million CEO salaries go away, and there are no shareholders that demand a profit. We can provide healthcare with the amount of money that we're spending on healthcare right now, about $3 trillion a year. We can provide healthcare for the 20-some million Americans who now are uninsured or underinsured. We waste about another 30 cents of our healthcare dollar on administrative costs. So some of you folks may have read about this hospital in North Carolina at Duke University. They have 900 beds. They have 1,000 billing clerks who are doing the red tape shuffle with the doctors and the nurses and the myriad of insurance companies. They're spending about 30 cents of our healthcare dollar on administrative costs. I had lunch with a retired physician the other day. She told me on some days she would spend up to half of her day filling out paperwork to justify charges to the insurance company. I was naive. I was under the impression that doctors and nurses spent almost their entire day taking care of patients. And unfortunately, I had a conversation with a doctor in Adair County the other day, and he told me he hired a nurse specifically to fill out paperwork to justify charges to the insurance company. Other countries that have something like Medicare for all, universal health care, single payer, public option, whatever it is, those administrative costs, for the most part, go away. Yes, there will be some small administrative cost, but without spending any more money on our healthcare system, we can have quality, affordable healthcare for every American. I personally like a public option. We didn't have to outlaw the horse and buggy. We just found more efficient ways to get around. I don't think we need to outlaw private health insurance companies. We just need to find more efficient ways to provide healthcare. And let me touch on one other thing in that regard, with regards to pharmaceutical drugs. I happen to be a veteran, so I get care at the VA. The VA negotiates pharmaceutical costs with the pharmaceutical companies, but our Medicare system is banned from doing that for no good reason other than the pharmaceutical companies have really good, well-heeled, well-funded lobbyists who are swaying things in Washington. We need to send somebody who has the will to fight for average Iowans, working Iowans, and folks who are struggling to pay the healthcare costs. Healthcare is the single biggest cause of bankruptcy in America, and we can change that if we have the political will to send the right people to Washington. And that's part of the reason I'm running.
Yeah. One question I like to throw at folks too, I think I love Iowa and having the caucus here, talking to so many journalists who aren't from here, they tend to fall in love with it as well. And so I love what I like to refer to as Iowa moments. And on the campaign trail, getting out there before obviously what we have to do now, but is there an Iowa moment for you that kind of sticks out in your head on the campaign trail?
Yes, as a matter of fact, and this was once again in Larchwood. It was my very first night knocking doors last June. Beautiful summer night, and of course it didn't get dark and sunset wasn't until about 9 p.m. And so I figured, well, I'll knock on a few. People were still out and about, and even though it was getting close to 9 o'clock, and so I figured I'll knock on a few more doors. 3 of the last 4 doors that I knocked on, I'd say retired ladies, probably around my age, maybe somewhere around there. And I told them who I was and what party I was in and what I was doing, what I was up to. And they all were a little bit hesitant, reluctant, as you might expect. And while they were hesitating, I said, now, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about Washington, what would it be? They all said the same thing. They said, we need to remove Donald Trump from office. And I was a little surprised about that. Now, that's just anecdotal. It was 3 of the last 5 houses I knocked on. And I thought, well, this is anecdotal information, but I think more than anything, first and foremost, this election next November will be a referendum on our current president and the things that have been happening in our country. And even before the coronavirus thing, we had a lot of challenges in this country that can be taken on if we have the resolve to send the right people to Washington. The next morning, I was in Ottawa, near the Missouri River, and I was having breakfast at the hotel there with a retired couple from Southeast Nebraska. And they asked me if I was in sales. I said, no, I'm kind of thinking about getting into politics. And without my asking, now, this was an older, well-dressed, retired couple. He was a retired salesman. And I assumed he might be a Republican, but I didn't ask and he didn't offer. And when I told him I was thinking about getting into politics, the first thing he said was, well, the first thing we have to do is get rid of Donald Trump. So first and foremost, I think just from the anecdotal evidence I've experienced from talking to folks, I think this is going to be a referendum on Trump and his failure as a leader of this nation.
Yeah. We have our first question from Tom, and he said, or Tim, I'm sorry. Tim asked, he wants you to, what's your thoughts on, or not thoughts, what's your plans on climate change?
Wow. That was one of the main reasons that I got into this race, because as I mentioned before, I wasn't seeing the sense of urgency and determination, passion to fight for our climate. Excuse me. I was down in Decatur County a few months back, and I mentioned something about climate change, and a young lady interrupted me, Kay Rengie, and she said, no, Cal, it's a climate crisis. And I said, Kay, you're absolutely right about that. We are faced with the challenge right now where we've been pumping more carbon into the atmosphere than we have since human beings have walked this planet. And it's headed in the wrong direction. and the amount of carbon in our atmosphere, the warming is only going to continue unless we get serious about addressing our climate challenge right now. There's a million different solutions. We're probably going to need them all. But first, we need to address the issue of how much carbon we're pumping into the atmosphere. Let's start with eliminating the $20 billion welfare check that we give to the fossil fuel industry every year, courtesy of the American taxpayer. And let's phase that out so there's no more incentives to build more coal-fired power plants. And let's phase in more research and development on solar and wind. Iowa is already a leader in wind turbine energy. I think we're number 2 in the total energy generated by wind turbines, just behind Texas, which is a much bigger state. And, you know, I've been surprised, all the rural roads I've been on and all the hog confinements I've seen in the last 6 months. A lot of those hog confinements, the farmers have set up solar panels outside those hog confinements. It's the future. At any one time, the sun gives us 173, fun fact here, 173,000 trillion watts of energy, 173,000 terawatts of energy, which is 10,000 times the amount of energy that all the human beings on the planet are using at any one time. The challenge right now is capturing that energy. Battery technology is getting better. Other forms of storing energy, like having a very simple hydrogen hydrolyzer in your basement where you can produce hydrogen during the day when the sun is shining, and then when the sun goes down at night, if you want to run your furnace or your television or whatever, you can use that hydrogen. That's a relatively rudimentary system that is not too far in the offing. 3 young men just won a Nobel Prize for their developments in battery technology. So electricity is our future. We had more electric trains in this country 100 years ago than we have now. We're way behind most other developed nations in electric trains. We have electric cars. Those numbers are growing every day. We have electric buses. We still have a few electric trains, but electricity is our future. Between wind and solar, we will eventually be able to provide nearly all the energy that this country needs. The technology needs some improvement, but we're working on that. And one other solution, and this is more of a long-range solution, there is something like around the globe, 1 trillion acres of land available for planting somewhere around several hundred billion trees, which eventually, now trees take some time to grow clearly, but eventually we can, if we plant enough trees on, this is land that is not currently used for row crops and not currently used for urban development, just land that for the most part is lying fallow all over the globe, we can eventually use those trees. The technology for trees to sequester carbon has been on for as long as trees have been on the planet, for billions of years. So if we plant trees on all the acres that are available all across the globe, and much of that is in the United States, and of course much of it is in Russia and China, the other big nations, we can remove up to eventually about half of the human generated carbon that's in our atmosphere. Now, trees are not a quick solution, but we're probably going to need, there's probably a million different solutions to our climate crisis, and we're probably going to need them all. But we need to make the transition to eliminating, reducing our use of fossil fuels and increasing our use of energy, electrical energy generated from wind and solar.
Yeah, that's great. One thing that I think about often that I don't think gets talked about nearly enough is we have climate refugees here in the state of Iowa, just down south. And so it's something that when I mention that to folks who are not from here, everyone thinks it's the coast. But with the flooding that happened last year, it's eye-opening to talk about it in that way, that we have climate refugees here in Iowa, down in Hamburg and southwest
Right.
Iowa.
Absolutely. You're talking about folks down in southwest Iowa on Mills, Page, Fremont counties.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know what the flooding potential is looking like this spring, but that's going to happen over and over again. As we get more carbon in our atmosphere, the drier places are going to, the hotter places are going to get hotter, the wetter places are going to get wetter, and we need to address this climate change now so that young folks, children now will have the same relatively cool, temperate climate to grow up in that we had. You know, our United States military, no one would accuse of being a bunch of environmental tree huggers.
Yeah.
Our United States military is already making contingency plans for the eventuality not of millions, but tens of millions of climate refugees, people who've been forced out of their homes because of floods, people who've been forced out of their farms because of drought. There's islands in the Pacific, in the Marshall Islands, that now are just a few feet above sea level at high tide, or especially at king tide. The salt water washes over their islands. It pollutes their taro fields. They can't grow taro, which is one of their major crops. When the salt water rushes in, some of their freshwater wells have been contaminated with salt water. Our climate crisis is real, and we need to address it, not so much for my generation, but for your generation and the next after that. If we don't, we're going to see things that we don't want our kids and our grandkids to see. Things can get really ugly if we don't start to address our climate crisis now. It's going to lead to food shortages, and that's not something that we want to see.
That's exactly right. One thing that I'm looking forward to after we get out and about and we're able to either hug each other or even handshake each other or at least fist bump. I'm a big music person. Is there a music concert that you'd be eager to go to? What would be a group that you'd like to see when we're done with this? Or if you're not a music person, something else.
Yeah, well, I've volunteered at the 8035 Festival, which is a great event here in Des Moines. And the last I heard, that's been either canceled or postponed. So there's a lot of festivals and a lot of musicians that I really would like to see. I think we'll leave it at that. I'm really looking forward to getting back to festivals like the 8035. It's a great festival, and yeah, you're right. The bars have been closed, the music venues have closed. We just had a nice new music venue built at Waterworks Park here in Des Moines, and obviously nobody's going to be playing there for the foreseeable future. One of my favorite local musicians, Heath Allen, he plays, I would say, probably once or twice a month here in Central Iowa, and I have an opportunity to see him. Haven't been able to do anything like that. So I know there's a lot of music lovers out there who are looking forward to having those opportunities. How about you, JD? Do you have any favorite artists you're waiting to see?
I have a bunch of friends who are in bands, and anytime they come through the Midwest, I try to connect with them. I have a bunch of friends from when I lived in Minneapolis and when I lived in Seattle, and so those are kind of it's more relationship than actual music. But what I've been trying to do, I know here in Sioux City we have the Marquee that has a lot of music venues, or a lot of music that they bring, and they're trying to keep musicians going during this time, and so they'll have things through them that they'll stream. And so I always try to watch it and throw the musicians a couple bucks to appreciate their time and their efforts and their talents. So
JD, I don't know if you remember, I met you at Art Cullen's speaking event last May. He's Pulitzer Prize-winning editor of the Storm Lake Times. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yep.
And he had talked about a little bar there in Buena Vista County.
Pomeroy.
Yeah, is that the one that they have musicians from all over the country?
Yep, Byron.
I just read his book, and I look forward to getting out there. We don't know when that's going to be. That's going to be an opportunity to get out and about again, but I'm certainly looking forward to getting up to. It's called Pomeroy's?
No, it's in the town of Pomeroy. It's called Byron's.
Okay, so. Yeah. So it sounds like an interesting place, and it sounds like the owner of the bar brings in some really interesting and eclectic musical acts from both coasts and all over the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We got a question from Karen, and Karen asks, as a senator, what committees would you seek to join?
Well, I think, first of all, energy and any committee where we can have some impact on our climate crisis. Number two, agriculture. We have a lot of work to do. We've lost something like 35 ethanol plants and I think a handful of biodiesel plants. And even before, there was an article in the paper either yesterday or today about 2 more ethanol plants that are shutting down. One is cellulosic ethanol. But we need to not be dependent on China for telling us how to run our agricultural system. For the first thing we have to do is eliminate foreign ownership of any packers or any agricultural. China does not have our best interests in mind. We know that. And we cannot be at China's mercy. And this whole coronavirus thing brings up the issue that to some extent we have been dependent on China in too many regards, not only with regards to them calling the shots in too much of our agricultural system, but when it comes to the ventilators and the masks and the protective equipment, we've been waiting on China. We need to ramp up production in this country so we're not dependent on China. who is not going to be our friend long-term. And we cannot be dependent on a possible adversary for our national security. So we have a lot of work to do in agriculture and our climate crisis.
So the state of Iowa, it is illegal for foreign ownership on their farms or for buying land. But at the same time, the way that these monopolies work, they're handcuffing our farmers. You look at Smithfield's owned by China Pork, and the CEO of China Pork in 2017 made $291 million, which is more than Tim Cook from Apple or Elon Musk. And then if you ask any pork producer how did they do in 2017, it's exactly right. China currently owns 400 farms in the U.S., 33 meatpacking plants, and 1 out of every 4 hog in the U.S. And one of our strengths as a nation is we're a secure nation because we're a food secure nation, and food sovereignty is one of the things that I'm really hoping to push post COVID-19 and really creating alternative markets, creating the infrastructure, more local regional food hubs. And so, yeah.
Could not agree more. And China does not have our best interests in mind. We cannot be subject to China as we are now for our, and you're right, agricultural security, food security is national security.
Yeah, absolutely. So got a question here from someone watching, where was it at? Sorry. Yep. Many students are living in poverty all over the country. Therefore, many of them go hungry and rely on our schools for food. What's your plan to end youth poverty and hunger?
Wow, excellent question. I don't know if I have a pat answer for that one. I do know that starting with increasing the minimum wage for anybody who's working part-time, maybe while they're going to school, or certainly working in the summer, but we need to have an economy that works for working families, for students. I have suggested on our website that we need to provide opportunities. I don't know if free tuition in all of our higher institutions of higher learning is the answer, but I would like to see opportunities for kids who are interested in going to our junior colleges or prep schools, something like that, where trade schools, I should say. I'd entertain a proposal that we cover the tuition for those folks because they can enter the job force in needed occupations in manufacturing and in the trades relatively quickly and make a relatively good income. I would just say with regards to students, I think we need to beef up our minimum wage and opportunities. I would be in favor of expanding Pell Grants and other opportunities for students to make their way through college. So their future is our future. The security of our nation is again dependent on a well-educated workforce. So whatever we can do to help those kids, I'd be open to having those discussions.
Yep. With that, Kyle, I think we'll wrap things up. Before we get off, if they want to know more about you, learn more about you and your positions and everything, where can they go? Where can everybody go?
Yeah, the website is calforiowa.com. We are going to have a number of similar town halls to this at a number of counties around the state, and we'll have those posted on our website as well. So it's calforiowa.com. And JD, I thank you for doing this, and I want to wish you all the best in your campaign. And to everybody and your loved ones and your family and Cody's family, I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and let's kick this coronavirus thing.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you for your time. Have a good night.
Thank you all. Take care. See you.